Okay, so I'm going to show you a little bit what I mean about knowing the right place to look in the image so you can create a consistent look from image to image quickly. I've pulled in a couple images from one of my clients who is a wedding photographer, and she's given me permission to use these images, so I'm going to do a quick demonstration of editing two images that are really similar to one another, but not exactly the same. If I did the same image, it wouldn't be as realistic as it would, because usually for a wedding you might shoot a lot of images that are really similar to one another, but never two that are exactly the same. So I picked two images that are pretty similar to one another. The first one is this one. Obviously, this is the unedited one. This is almost straight out of camera. There's been a few adjustments that have been made already, but I'm just basically going to go through some basic tonal adjustments because this is supposed to be just a really short tutorial. And then this image. This is one image that is similar to the other one, but it's already been edited in a way that reflects the photographer's style and what she's looking for, and basically considered to be a complete image. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this image look like this image. And I'll show you where I'm looking in the image to make sure I achieve that. So first what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure I can look at both images at the same time, and Lightroom has an option built in for you to do that. You can click the second screen option here, and that'll make it pop up in a pop-up window, and set it to locked so it stays on this image. And then I'm going to go back to the other image, and I'm going to get started. Now, right off the bat, you can see that this image is a little bit darker and a little bit warmer, and probably a little bit more magenta just from the cast that's on her skin. So I'm going to get started. First, what I'm going to do, and so you know, I'm using a editing keyboard that I like to use that speeds up my editing workflow. So if it looks a little strange that my mouse isn't making the adjustments, it's because it's not. I'm actually using a specialty editing keyboard to do that. Okay, so looking at this image, a few different things I noticed right off the bat. I'm looking at the darkest parts of the image and the brightest parts of the image. The darkest parts would be in the shadows, so like in the trees up around the bride and in the bushes over here, and the brightest part would be in her face because she's the focus of the image. Now when I compare these areas of the image to the image that's considered edited, I'm going to zoom in a little bit, you can see that you can see more detail here than you can here, or at least I hope you can, and that's coming across from my screen recording. And you can see more detail in the hedges over here. So just to show you a difference, the leaves pop a little bit more over here than they do here. And this area of the image here is kind of lost in shadow, where in this one there's a little bit more detail. So I can tell that the image isn't bright enough in those areas. And now looking at the brightest part of the image, which is her face, this particular photographer likes her images to be really bright. So that means that the area of the image that's being exposed, which in this case is the bride and her face, it's considered exposed when the details in the brightest part of her face are just barely starting to lose definition and detail. So you can see in the edited image, in the apples of her cheek and her forehead and her brow and her chin, and a little bit on her collarbone line, the details are just starting to fade out a little bit, and that's what we consider to be well exposed for this image. You may think it's too bright. That's okay. That's not necessarily your style. Again, just kind of explaining to you how I edit from one image to the next. If you look at this image, you can see that all the details are maintained in her face, and the apples of her cheek, her brow, her chest aren't nearly as bright as they are here. So it's a quick overview of like where I'm looking in the image to determine, you know, is it bright enough, is it dark enough? And then the other thing I'm looking to is the white balance. And if I can zoom in here, you can see that this one is a little bit cooler than this one. And for this, I'm looking at large patches of skin, if available, so like her arm and her chest, and it's just easier to compare back and forth. You don't always have that in each image, but generally I look for the largest patch of skin in one image and compare it to the next one if I'm doing a comparison. So that's just an idea. You may do it differently, but that's how I do it. So now getting started, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure it's exposed properly. And I'll do that by adjusting first the exposure slider. So I'm going to bring it up, and it's a little bit brighter there. So I would say at this point it's probably exposed the same, at least in her face. But there's quite a bit of difference in tone and brightness between her face and the surroundings. Like you can see in this image, there's more detail in the shadows. But if I were to brighten this image until I got that detail back, her face would be too bright. So I'm going to balance that out by adjusting the highlights and the shadows, and then of course the exposure on top of that. So I'm going to bring the highlights down, so I bring the brightest part of her face a little bit darker so that doesn't blow out. I'm going to bring the shadows up a little bit to bring in some of the detail and some of the darker parts of the image. And then from there I'm going to increase the exposure. That's probably a bit too much right there. That's probably just about good for now. Right about there. And then the next thing I'm going to do is adjust the contrast. In this image, you can see it's a little bit darker between the shadows on her face, or there's more contrast or a bigger difference in light between the darker parts of her face and the lighter parts of her face. And I'm looking like around her cheek here, and under her chin and in her eyes compared to her cheek. This maybe isn't the best image to compare that to, so hopefully you can kind of get at least what I mean. But I'm going to increase the exposure, or excuse me, the contrast, till right about there. And now it looks like, just to go back to what it was, and then to increase it back closer to where it should be. You'll notice that the difference between the brighter parts of the image and the darker parts of the image are more pronounced and more similar to that difference in this image. And again, I'm comparing that between the brighter parts of her face and the darker parts of her face and making sure that difference is about similar, like around her face here and underneath her chin and so on. It's a little bit harder to see in this image, but again, just giving you an idea of like where I'm looking. So from there, that looks pretty good. I'm gonna zoom back out a little bit. I'm going to check out some of the darker parts of the image here. It looks like there's still a little bit of detail I'm lacking in the shadows, just a little bit. So I'm actually going to pull the blacks up a little bit because that can help. To right about, actually I'm going to pull them down just a little bit more. I think it should be closer to there. And I'm looking at these leaves over here compared to these leaves here. And to me, that looks a little bit better. And it also keeps the shadows and the dark parts of the image as dark as they should be. So I'm getting pretty close here. Her face looks pretty good. It looks pretty similar. The only thing I'm going to change is the whites look a little bit brighter in this image than this image. And whites are a harder thing to pin down if you're not really used to working with them. The best way to do it is just to experiment with the white slider until you get used to seeing how it changes in image. And for this one, I can tell because I'm looking at her chest here compared to here. Her chest here looks duller in a way than here. Like this one looks almost like the brights are brighter. And that's kind of an indication that the whites are too high. So I'm just going to pull it down just a little bit. So you see that change between here and here. It adjusts the brightness of the whites and pulls it right about to where it should be. Again, that's something that you really kind of have to play with. But in an image, you want to look at the brightest parts of the image because that's where you'll be able to tell. And for here, that's like her face, and like I said, her chest. Her chest is just easier to see it on because it's a large patch of skin that you can focus on as opposed to like a smaller one. So zooming back out here, I'd say overall this looks pretty good. The next step is going to be to compare white balances. So I'm going to pull the temperature down, and that looks pretty close. The only thing that's different is that this image is more magenta. And it's probably easier to tell if I'm looking again here on her chest and her shoulders. Over here, there's more magenta in her skin here, and it looks pinker than it does here. You can also tell by looking at the leaves in the image a little bit. Here, you'll notice that they're more pink and warm in color, and here they're more green in color. So I'm going to pull the magenta quite a bit, and because I've done that, I need to move the temp slider down again to right about probably there. That's probably pretty close. I'm going to compare that again. It's probably just a little bit warmer here than it is here. but it's much closer than it was before, so that would probably be considered okay. And now the last thing I'm probably going to do, because Lightroom is a dynamic environment, I'm going to increase the exposure a little bit more, because sometimes changing the temp slider will also change how it exposed, because changing the tone changes the light, which affects how the color is shown in the image. So it's a dynamic environment, so you can't just change the exposure and the tones without expecting to sometimes make an adjustment to the white balance. So looking at these two images, I would say they look pretty good. The detail in the shadows is similar, the white balance is similar, the tone is similar, the contrast is similar. We're probably about ballpark for where it should be. And I would consider both of these images to be edited and done, just so you can look and see a little bit closer, compare her face, compare the dark parts and the light parts, her skin tones, and so on. And that's how I would do it.